Ladies and gentlemen, to introduce our keynote session, please welcome Global President of Capital Markets, CBRE, Chris Ludeman.
Greetings. I was reflecting upon the, remember those of you that heard Alan Simpson a couple of years ago, and I had the pleasure of introducing Alan, and he said of all the introductions he ever received, that was the latest. And that was, I thought, funny. So that was my latest introduction. It's my great pleasure to introduce Mary Ludgin, who is the Managing Director of Heitman's Global Research Unit, and she is an equity owner in the firm. She's the author of too many articles to mention, and prior to her joining Heitman, she was an urban planner for the city of Chicago and a retail site expert. She is a member of almost every committee, if not every committee that matters at Heitman, and she is a lovely person. She has a low self-esteem and a great sense of humor. I told her I'd make a lot of stuff up about her. She has won 3 Nobel Peace Prizes, a Pulitzer Prize, and she was on deck for an Oscar last year and took a selfie with Arnold Schwarzenegger. So with that, Mary, the panel is all yours.
It's all true. I was Best Actress in my high school class, despite one small role, that being the extent of my high school acting career. I think it was for Theater in the Halls. We're going to bring a little good theater to you today, and I'm going to go back a moment to something that was just referenced, which is decades ago. I was a student of economic development and then subsequently an urban planner for the city of Chicago during an era in which the Rust Belt, the Frost Belt, you decide on what derogatory term would be applied to it, it was going to crumple up like a dry leaf and blow away. High tax locations like the Northeast were hemorrhaging jobs. Most of them, those that still existed, were leaving for lower cost locations. Connecticut and Illinois' losses were Texas and South Carolina's gains. Similarly, within metropolitan areas, high-cost center cities were losing jobs to pastoral and less expensive suburban settings. Many of you lived through this same period, as did my colleagues to my left. 35 or so years later, the landscape has gotten considerably more complex. What we've learned is that low cost does not necessarily mean job growth, nor does high cost necessarily mean no growth. Instead, similar to those of you that are in the retail sector that long ago realized that it's not just the rent that's relevant to a retailer's decision on where to locate, it's total occupancy cost versus the potential sales. Well, it appears as if companies are figuring out that it's not just the taxes they pay, duh, but the value proposition that a location represents. The title of our panel is You Get What You Pay For. You can see something of a point of view here, and delivering that point of view for you are 3 of the distinguished fellows of the Urban Land Institute. I'm going to introduce them by name. You're welcome to revel in their backgrounds, which are fascinating, by going onto the ULI website. To my immediate left is Maureen McAvey. To her left is Ed McMahon, and to his left is Tom Murphy. And our plan is to run about 45 minutes or until you shout us down. And we're going to talk about what you should be thinking about as taxpayers, as developers, as investors on the factors that are influencing global competitiveness.
Thank you, Mary. What we're going to do is, assuming this will work. Hello.
It did.
There we go.
Okay, great. Let me go back then a minute. We're going to basically talk about, as Mary said, what you get for your money and what your choices are as we think about going forward in this 21st century. And I think we all see words bandied about like globalization, technology, competition. Have you got vision? Are we leading in innovation, et cetera? And we're always worried about how we measure all of this. What are the appropriate metrics? So let's spend a couple of minutes thinking about what we are paying for what we are getting. On the Washington, D.C. front, we have a legislature totally caught up in thinking about various priorities. Many of us might think that their greatest priority at the moment is the next set of elections, but they're also considering education, infrastructure, leadership issues, immigration, et cetera. And we see in what we're facing with in the newspapers every day challenges of dysfunctionality, of diversity, of disparity, and states that are widely disparate within our own country. Part of that is encouraging us to really think about what do we want to be within our companies, within our communities, what kind of states do we want to be, and what kind of a nation do we want to be? What are we willing to pay for? My colleague Tom Murphy has often said, we want it all and we want it for nothing. And that's in many cases where we are. Where can we build some support for how we invest in our own future? And when we think about this, let's look at taxes for just a minute. What I really want you to pay attention in on this map is the difference in colors. Forget who's Republican, who's Democrat, that's not the point here. What is the point is that there is a marked difference in what you get for your money. For every federal dollar of tax that these states pay in, there are donor states and there are recipient states. The donor states, like Minnesota, gets 64 cents back for every dollar they put in. When I say 64 cents back, those payments come back in Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, support payments for children, food stamps, education assistance, infrastructure payments, et cetera. So Minnesota, on the one hand, is a donor state. For every dollar it sends in, it gets 64 cents back. Then we have recipient states. For every dollar they send in, West Virginia, for example, gets $2.83 back. And this disparity is incredibly marked. You think about West Virginia getting back 4 times more than Minnesota gets back. So one could argue about fairness, one could argue about need and about poverty levels, and there are a lot of complex issues in this calculation of what you get back and what you give, but it argues for how we are going to maybe not level the playing field, but create a country that works for most of us. When we think about the state and local tax question, that's also complicated. And as I got into this research, it's a very complicated question because we have city taxes, we have all sorts of surtaxes on things, as well as state taxes. One of the questions is, who pays? Do residents pay, non-residents, tourists? All of you are paying tourist taxes. What is taxed? Is it sales tax, property tax, corporate tax, natural resources tax, et cetera? And where does the money go once you pay it? And not only do we have great disparity on the revenue side, we have great disparity on what you receive. So states with high taxes, both federal taxes and state and local taxes, like New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Minnesota again, are paying often both high federal taxes and state and local taxes. Then we have states with low tax burdens, Alaska, partially because of their high natural resources and oil taxes, South Dakota, Louisiana, Wyoming. These are the states you can imagine have low tax burdens, but very high recipient quotients, if you will, on a federal tax basis. So as I mentioned, we see both marked inputs and marked outputs. When we think about these outputs, what I think we want to at least give a little bit of consideration to is things that fuel our economy: an educated workforce, investments in infrastructure, and support for innovation. Both Ed and Tom are going to talk about those issues in a little more depth. But I think what we want to at least give a moment of thought to is attracting talent for our companies and for our country. We have, again, a big difference in what we're calling young adult degree attainment. This is at least 2 years of post-high school education for those young people who are 25 to 34. On the international front, we have places like Mexico that only have 19% of their young adults with any post-secondary education. Places like Canada, where 55% of their young people have post-secondary education. And you see on the left side of your chart a marked difference again in the state degree of advanced education, if you will. West Virginia, Nevada, et cetera, very low. The high tax states, Minnesota, Massachusetts, Colorado, et cetera, are doing pretty well at educating our leaders of the future. Is this what we want? And is it worth paying for? The old value was education was the ticket to success. Many of us grew up in this arena. There are studies that show that if you have a degree, you will earn in the neighborhood of $2.5 million more dollars than if you just have a high school diploma. Many would say it is not only worth it to society, but worth it to the individual. But that gap is growing. The Lumina Foundation has indicated that 67% of all new jobs that are being created by 2020 will require some degree of post-secondary education. And many states are failing this requirement. So we're spending money on education. New York spends about $19,000 for each of its students. Texas spends $9,000. We see on the college level, the hard degrees pay off. If you send your child and he or she gets an engineering degree, that degree pays off. Some of the arts degrees, not so much, perhaps.
We do have to say, those of us that thought about majoring in English or that actually majored in political science, that the definition of what payoff is may need to be broadened.
See, they speak well. They write well.
They act well.
And they think clearly.
And certainly the cost of education has risen dramatically, 5 times the rate of inflation since 1983. There is an entity called payscale.com. If you want to see a return on investment for the college that you might send your son or daughter to, it's worth taking a look at. They do an ROI calculation over a 20-year time frame. Pretty interesting to look at. So on the high-tech job front, which has certainly been one of the bright lights of our economy, the leading states are California, not surprising, Texas, perhaps surprising, given how little they spend on education. Texas is ranked 47th out of 50 states in education. It's improving, but it is not one of our best states in terms of education. But it is growing high-tech jobs dramatically because there are spotlights, like Austin, of a great workforce. So we have questions that we all face. We face them in our company, in our families, in our society. We can choose what markets we choose to develop in, to live in, to invest in. The, if you will, high-tech, high-education markets, Boston, New York, et cetera. We can choose locations for our companies, the environments we've talked about that attract young people. We can choose these projects and build these projects, and we can choose not only what kind of employees we have, but who we will encourage and foster with lifelong education. We can support scholarships for young people. We can offer our own employees additional learning opportunities. We can invest in private infrastructure, both in some of these funds, but we can also add infrastructure enhancements, as you saw in some of the slides you've seen today, to the projects we build. And we can understand some of the nuance of public policy. What I was trying to show with this is it is not a simple answer of no taxes or lots of taxes. It is a nuanced and complicated equation these days, and not given to easy ideology, despite what some of the ideologues might tell us. So with that, let's think about how we actually look more fully at infrastructure. Ed?
Yeah, thank you, Maureen, and good afternoon, everybody. You know, I've been thinking about this topic for a long time. In fact, it goes back many, many years to when I was a young second lieutenant in the United States Army during the peak of the Vietnam War. I had orders, I had just finished jungle warfare training, and I had orders to a small fire base in the central highlands of Vietnam. And about 1 week before I'm supposed to go, I got a call from this colonel at the Pentagon, and he says to me, "Lieutenant McMahon, do you have any interest in being reassigned to Germany?" And I'm like, okay, let me think about that, Germany or Vietnam? And I said, yes, Germany sounds very exciting. I would love to go to Germany. And I got incredibly lucky. I was sent to Heidelberg, West Germany, which is the headquarters for the U.S. military in Europe. I was assigned as an aide to a United States general. I then spent the next 2.5 years of my life traveling all over Europe in a helicopter. And that experience completely and totally changed my life. But of course, I didn't realize how much it would change my life until I flew home to Birmingham, Alabama, where I grew up. And I got out of the airplane and drove home, and for the first time ever, I saw the American landscape with a completely different set of eyes. Because, ladies and gentlemen, to travel is to learn. And one of the things that I learned was that, you know, what you do indeed get what you pay for, especially when it comes to infrastructure and transportation. In Europe, where gas prices have always been 3 times more expensive than they are in the United States and Canada, they had the luxury of choice, a luxury we did not have. So you could, of course, drive in Europe, and they invented the interstate highway system. They called it the Autobahns. You could fly. You could take high-speed trains. You could take trolleys. You could take streetcars. You could take buses. You could even ride a bicycle safely and conveniently to get where you wanted to go. You could even walk. But when I went home to Birmingham, we only had one way to get around, and that was to drive our car everywhere for everything. So one of the questions that we talk about a lot at ULI is how do we shape more competitive cities? Maureen has talked a lot about the role of education. I'd like to talk for a minute about the role of infrastructure. You know, we've been doing an annual infrastructure report now for about 8 years. And every year, in a different way, we say the same thing. We say, number one, the United States is one of the very few countries in the world that does not have a national plan for infrastructure. Every state has its own plan. Number two, we have a huge infrastructure deficit. We haven't raised the federal gas tax since 1993. And so, you know, what we start to think about, well, what is infrastructure? Well, what it is, it's just really the basic underpinnings of upon which the health and growth of any community or city depends. But, you know, when we just found in our most recent survey, where we surveyed about 250 leading real estate brokers and finance people and developers, and then leading mayors around the country, we said, well, what is influencing real estate in your community today? They said the biggest driver is infrastructure. Second was consumer demand. But then they went on to say that the thing that concerns them most is the public's willingness to pay or to not pay for infrastructure. And you know, as Tom has said many times, we do indeed in America, certainly we want the best of everything. We spend a lot of time chanting we're number one at lots of things. But, you know, we're just not willing, we want the best of everything, we're just not willing to pay for anything. And I think part of the problem is that many of our elected officials don't really understand the difference between spending and investment. So let's just say that my wife and I went out to a fancy restaurant once a month in Washington, D.C., where we live now, and, you know, let's say we spend $200 a month. Well, at the end of the year, we'd be approaching like $2,000 a year. Well, that money is gone. We spend it. It does not come back to us. But suppose I spent $2,000 a year to put insulation in my attic, and I put a new deck on the back of the house, and maybe I got a more energy-efficient air conditioner. Well, that's investing in increasing the value of my home. The same thing is true with infrastructure in the cities that invest in themselves. One of the questions that I always ask is, why would anybody invest in a community that simply wouldn't invest in itself? So, you know, we have lots of choices when it comes to things like economic development. Here's a great example. This is what used to be an abandoned, elevated rail line in lower Manhattan. And, you know, we had many people who thought of it simply as an eyesore. There was a small group that was advocating for restoring it and turning it into a 1-mile-long elevated park. But the focus was on cost. They said, well, we can't really afford to do that. Well, it was expensive to restore that elevated rail line into now this elevated park called the Highline. The city of New York spent $110 million. They raised $44 million in private funds. That's a lot of money, but that park has now generated $2 billion in private investment directly adjacent to the park. It's created 12,000 jobs in lower Manhattan, in addition to the 8,000 construction jobs. It has transformed an entire swath of the city. Here's another example. We used to always talk about it's too expensive to underground utility wires. One of the things that always amazed me living in Europe was they routinely undergrounded utility wires everywhere you went. But here it was always, we can't afford to do that. Well, Pepco, which is the power company for the Washington Capital region, has just announced they're going to start spending $1 billion to underground utility wires. Why? Because they've decided we can't afford not to underground the utility wires, because the storms are coming more frequently. The power is staying out longer. And so all of a sudden we've started to think about it in a different way. It's not just a cost, it's an investment in the future. So we've talked a lot, as we said in the past, over the years at ULI about the impact of technology and consumer attitudes and trends and all these other factors, the economy. I just want to say a couple of quick words about economic development. You know, we have a model in America. When I was growing up, it was all about cheap land, cheap gas, low-cost labor. It was about shotgun recruitment. The quality of life in a community really didn't matter. And our most important infrastructure investment, certainly in a rural state like Alabama, was roads. It was like, well, let's just widen all the highways. And then we would just line all the highways with a bunch of junk. Today, we realize it's not about low cost, it's about high value. It's not about cheap labor, it's about highly valued talent. It's not about shotgun recruitment, it's about laser recruitment. Turns out quality of life is critically important in the world that we live in today. And the most important infrastructure investment today, as Maureen has already referred to, is not roads, it is education. So I would suggest to you that we have some economic development imperatives. One is talent, another is innovation, third is connectivity, and fourth is distinctiveness. We've already talked about the importance of talent. Young people are deciding where they want to live. They're moving to those cities, and then they look for a job, very different from what happened when I was a young person. Innovation, things like patents and venture capital, self-employment. This is all about the willingness to take risk. Connectivity is no longer about road junctions and interstate highways. It's about the ability to easily connect people and ideas. It's about internet connectivity, connection to global markets, etc. And I'd also suggest to you that one of the key economic imperatives going forward is distinctiveness. We live in a global economy where capital is footloose. If you can't differentiate your community from any other community, you will simply have no competitive advantage. You know, this is a new publication from the World Bank about the economics of uniqueness, and they simply say that sameness is not a plus in the world that we live in today. So I'd like to just end by saying, you know, one thing. This is a picture of the Riverwalk down in Oklahoma City, which was paid for by a vote of the people who voted to increase their taxes to pay for this, as they've done a number of times. You know, economic competitiveness today really is about creating places that people want to be. And so I'd just like to end again by saying, why would anybody invest in a community that simply wouldn't invest in itself?
Thanks, Sam. Good afternoon. Where am I pointing this? Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here with you. I'm not quite sure what time zone I'm in. Let me tell you where I've been in the last 6 weeks. I've been to Amsterdam, in Istanbul, in Atlantic City, in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, in Pittsburgh, in Toledo, Ohio. That's why I don't know where I am. And I've been in all those cities, and I've had opportunities to meet with the business leadership and the political leadership. And there's a sameness about every one of those cities. Have you ever heard that? The sameness is, regardless of whether it's Shanghai with 23 million people or Toledo with 150,000 people, they're all trying to figure out their place in the world. Every one of them is trying to figure out what their niche and what their competitive advantage is that will make a difference in how they compete in a world that is so global and so uncertain now. And more clearly than any place else, in the United States, I've jumped over it, okay. In the United States, if you look at this next slide, you will see that we have undergone literally a revolution in most cities in America over the last 20 years. Take Baltimore, for example. Baltimore, over the last 20 years, has lost almost 55% of its manufacturing jobs. 20 years ago, they had roughly the same amount of people in manufacturing working as they did in technology jobs in the universities and hospitals. Today, there are 4 times more people working in technology jobs in Baltimore than there is in manufacturing. Think of the impact that is on land use. Think of the impact that is on people's lives and the mismatch of educational background that permits people to work in manufacturing but does not permit them to work in the technology jobs that are being created. This is the challenge that every city in the world is facing now as we move forward. So in the recent Jones-Lang-LaSalle study shows that cities with technology economies are growing 4 times faster, their technology jobs, than the economy as a whole. It is redefining the landscape of America. And the choices we make around that, whether it is in the old economy of understanding that you build highways into industrial parks instead of the economic drivers are the universities and hospitals that are fundamentally changing the nature of it. And part of the driver of that, a big driver, is the research investment being made in this country. On average, we invest $400 billion a year in research in America, by far the most of any country in the world. And that's the raw material of innovation. That money goes out to universities and private research institutions across the country. Johns Hopkins, for example, in Baltimore, gets more than any other place in America. Almost $1.4 billion a year on average goes to Johns Hopkins alone for research. This is fundamentally the economic driver of the region. The other is, how do you move from that research to commercialization? And you know, there are stories all over the world. Here at this session, I was at an earlier session with 3 companies, startup companies that are fundamentally redefining the brokerage business in America for real estate. Xylo and others that are changing how people think about buying houses and how they get information. That's being funded by venture capital. In the United States has more venture capital, as you can see from this chart, being invested than any other place. That's the good news. The bad news is if you're not from Silicon Valley, England, or New York, you don't have a lot of venture capital being invested in your community. Almost 2/3 of the venture capital invested in America is invested in those 3 places. So if you're from Birmingham, Alabama, or Pittsburgh, or Toledo, the odds are, unless you're really working very hard, that the best and the brightest that you're educating in those universities, if they want to start a company, are moving someplace. You know the story of Facebook. Zuckerberg is in Boston, comes up with a great idea, wants to grow to 1 million people, and his friends say, well, if you want to get that big, you need to go to California to get the financing. And he does. Boston has an inferiority complex over it. Started a program to try to keep the next Zuckerberg in Boston. And Facebook, as you know, now has about 1 billion people on it. In fact, just yesterday in the Vancouver paper, there's an article you might have seen about the new faces of startups in Vancouver. And it says they're young, they're diverse, and they have access to capital. That is a critical part of what is driving the economy of every city in America, and should be. In fact, if I said to you, in the largest 100 cities in America, who's the largest employer? You might say government, you might say a certain company. In the 60 of the 100 largest cities in America, it's a university or a hospital. How they're seen and how they're seen as an economic driver is a very important part of the conversation. And as Maureen and Ed said, the driver, the most important raw material for a city to be successful is talent. And this is a great example, and I highlighted the research triangle, because you can see San Francisco and Boston at the end of the chart. They have high levels of advanced graduate degree, PhDs or advanced degrees, but the research triangle was there, because that was intentional. The research triangle is not there by accident. It's there because of civic and political leadership 30 years ago that made a decision that they were going to invest in education, that they saw that back when nobody else did clearly as an important piece of how they transform the North Carolina economy. That's in question now. The New York Times recently wrote an editorial about what's going on in North Carolina, really one of the really bright spots of the economy of the South. And if you think that we should be complacent because we have all that venture capital and this good educational talent, look at what China, in the last 10 years, China has tripled the number of their university students, have invested heavily in education, recognizing that talent is going to be the most important competitive advantage in a community. And this is probably the most dramatic example. Singapore and Jamaica both became, and this was talked about at a prior ULI conference, and it really stuck with me, and I did some research on it. Singapore and Jamaica became countries in the same year, in 1960. Singapore, the Prime Minister of Singapore, made a decision. Singapore, a poor third world country just starting out, made a decision that he wanted to be the most educated country in the world. Jamaica, on the other hand, made a decision to invest their resources in mineral extraction. 50 years later, look at the results. Singapore has the highest per capita income of any country in the world. It has the highest literacy rate of any country in the world. That the Prime Minister, who was Prime Minister for 50 years, lived by his commitment. And he understood then, back in 1960, how important education was. Maureen and Ed have mentioned the importance of investment. I want to highlight Denver as an example of a community that made a decision to tax itself, to invest in the future. If you've been to Denver, you know what the fast track is doing. In downtown Denver, around the old Union Station, there's $2 billion worth of development in the ground. It will transfix you to stand on that walking bridge at the end of the 16th Street Mall and look at all the development happening there. But you can go out and look at some of the stations and see the transit-oriented development beginning to happen. It's changing how people live in Denver. It's a remarkable investment. I mentioned the research triangle in education. True stories. In the early 60s, 6 guys are at a country club, get rained out from a golf game, and they come back and they're lamenting the fact that they educate their sons and daughters at the university, and then they move away because there was not much to do in the Raleigh-Durham, Chapel Hill area. There was tobacco and lumber. And those 6 guys went out and bought 7,000 acres of land, created a nonprofit organization called the Research Triangle, and 50 years later, it is one of the highest per capita and one of the highest per capita income and one of the most highly educated areas of the country, as you saw. It has created 40,000 jobs. It attracted companies from IBM to a whole host of other companies to that area, transformed the economy of the Research Triangle in that part of North Carolina. An intentional decision by partnering with the universities, but with the civic leadership and the political leadership of that community, transform that community. That's part of what this conversation is about. How does, whether it's Shanghai or Toledo or Pittsburgh or Istanbul, what are the ingredients that change that community? It's understanding how to build partnerships. It's understanding how you nurture and create an entrepreneurial spirit that encourages people to take risk, whether to start a business or think about government in a different kind of way. It's about well-managed. You need clean air. You need clean water. You need good transportation, as Ed said. You need to be educating your kids. You need to create a vibrant, exciting community that people want to be in because talent has choices about where they want to live. And so all those ingredients go into what makes a great city. And that's where we are now. Every city is looking out at a future that's getting redefined before their eyes. And there's a whole series of choices that cities need to make. And those choices need to be intentional. They need to be intentional choices about what kind of city we want. And that choice needs to include investment. You know, I was mayor of a city for 12 years, and I learned a lesson. The lesson I learned is that every time you want to do something different, there are going to be at least 100 people telling you not to do it. You're all developers or involved in real estate. You know that. And the choice is you listen to them and nothing ever happens, or you make a choice to run over them and get things done. That's the choice that you face. And every city is facing that you need to move to the future. You can't stay where you are. Thank you.
All right, everyone. We have 5 or so minutes. I get the first question. You get the next. Tom, you're being a little coy with us. You ran Pittsburgh. It's a story of transformation, a city on the decline that turned it around. Give us 3 concrete things that made a difference in Pittsburgh's revitalization.
Great partnerships that had a shared vision. So I met every week with the business leadership and the universities in the city. So we had the political leadership, the university leadership, and the business leadership focused on a change. Now, you know, we were Detroit in 1983. We had lost 500,000 people had left the Pittsburgh region. Didn't leave Pittsburgh, left the whole region. That's why you have so many Steeler fans in your cities. You thought they just come to the games. They live there now. And so we were, because the steel industry had collapsed, we were facing a really bleak future. We were losing 50,000 people a year, and in 1983, our unemployment rate was 22%. And the federal government wasn't there to help us as they did with the auto industry. So we had a fundamental choice to make about what we were going to do. And for me, a university president named Dr. Siret was the first person I heard that said the universities could be the economic engine for this community. That we could not just be a place to educate kids and do research, but we could understand how to commercialize that research. So those partnerships of how you build them and how you shape a business. And then there's a fundamental lesson I learned in politics. You have a choice when you want to make change. You can either be loved or be effective. You can't be both.
Thank you. I see a few people headed for microphones. Please, go ahead.
Hi, Dan Biederman. I had the great pleasure of doing a park in Pittsburgh with Mayor Murphy, so I wish I agreed with everything he said, but I don't. I'm from the Northeast, so half my income goes to the government. And I think what all of you have left out is to think too much about the inputs and not enough about the outputs. Where the money is seeping away is how government spends it. In the education field, you said Texas spends half what New York does, but I don't think most people believe that Texas education is half as good as a New York education. And in the infrastructure field, I wish I had a nickel for every time in my work in the Northeast somebody had said to me, you know, we can't afford that capital project because we're on a prevailing wage basis. The per hour rate is set by union discussion with elected officials. So there was a lot of talk about spend more, but not much recognition of how badly government spends most of the money they're given.
Who'd like to take the answer to that?
I'll answer part of that. I did a lot of research coming into this. We could only show a little tiny piece of it. There is no question, Dan, that it is a complicated issue. It's a complicated question on what taxes come in, and certainly complicated on what goes out, and how well it is spent. I think as a country and as some states, we are getting better. There is an opportunity, as that first slide showed, on looking at metrics of how are we measuring that return on investment. But at least from where I sit, I don't think the answer is slam all the door, no taxes, no government spending for anything, for any purpose. I don't think the answer for our future is that simple. And so the nuance and the analysis of how you look at what goes in and what comes out, and then how we in the business community can help elected officials make better decisions. You know, Tom's point's a pretty good one. You could be loved or you could be effective. And oftentimes business is not effectively at the table. I think we have an opportunity for change.
Tom.
I'd like to follow up on that question, please. My name is Jack Boyd. I'm from Southern California, the other end of the continent from the fellow who just spoke. And by way of background, I took the other choice and had the pleasure of being in Vietnam once, and then to Germany, and then back to Vietnam, and I too came back a changed person, maybe with this perspective. I don't think any of us doubt the fact that you have to pay, you get what you pay for. But in Southern California and California in general, I think we get tired of $60 billion speed trains, high-speed trains from Bakersfield to Modesto, a mass transit system that ends a mile away from the airport, bloated bureaucracies for public pension in downtown LA school districts. None of us would object to doubling the pay from $24,000 or $30,000 to $60,000 or $90,000 for a school teacher, and we don't like to be told that whenever we refuse to pay taxes, we're going to fire teachers or firefighters. We are never given the option of getting rid of the AQMD or slimming it down dramatically, or getting rid of or slimming down the Water Quality Control Board. So the issue is not, are you willing to pay for it? Heck yes, we're willing to pay for it. But we just don't trust the folks who are going to get the money. And when we choose the idea of let's starve the beast, then we risk the choice of being branded a right-wing ideologue who is saying no to everything.
Thanks for your comments. Tom, you wanted to respond.
Yeah, having run a city, I can agree with all of you. There's no reason to trust government, and I can say that government can be really inefficient. Let me just say that there's a revolution going on in government, and the answer to whoever the prior questionnaire is this is part of the revolution. Giuliani started it in New York with CompStats, which many of you have seen on television, which was how do you respond to crime, and how do you use technology, and how do you get in front of crime rather than reacting to crime. And New York went from having the highest murder rate per capita in the country to having the lowest murder rate in that in over a 3-year period. Because of that, it went from having almost 2,500 murders a year down to less than 500 murders a year in a 3-year period, because Giuliani began to think about how do you measure effectiveness in fighting crime. That got carried into by then Mayor Martin O'Malley, now Governor O'Malley in Maryland, into what is called city stats, was how do you measure the effectiveness of everything in a city, from picking up trash to roads. And we copied a lot of that. And so in my time as mayor, we went in the city from having 5,000 employees to 3,200. Let me tell you a secret. Every city thinks they need more police. But the reality is that 20% of the arrests, or excuse me, 80% of the arrests in a city are performed by 20% of the police officers. So if you can figure out who those 20% are, you don't need the other 80%. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but so you should be demanding of your elected officials, and they're your elected officials. You're electing them, and you get what you elect, right? And so you ought to be thinking about how do you get more transparency into government in terms of management, and how do you get people to actually give you a sense of how well they're managing? How do you measure that? That technology now exists.
Ed, a comment from you.
Yeah, you know, Albert Einstein used to say that for every complex problem, there's a simple solution, and it's almost always wrong. And, you know, I think that's the issue here. You know, clearly we have a lot of wasted spending that does not result in the kind of outcomes that we would like to see. But I can also tell you that we're becoming less competitive in the world because we are unwilling, in many cases, to actually make the tough choices that we need to make. I mean, you know, any of us who travels to China, I mean, we come back every time with like, you know, every American needs to see this, not just because of, you know, all of the, because we need to know what we're up against in the world. And, you know, yeah, they're a long way, they've got the worst pollution in the world, everything, but they are investing in themselves with their trains, everything in a way we would never even haven't even thought about. You know, Tom Friedman talks about flying from JFK to any of the new Asian airports. He says it's like going from the Flintstones to the Jetsons. And that's simply the truth in America. It takes Amtrak today 5.5 hours longer to go from Chicago to New York than it did in the 1930s. I mean, I will say, you know, maybe New York schools are not twice as good as Texas. I have no doubt that that's not true, but I will guarantee you that the public transportation system in Germany is twice as good as what we have in this country.
All right, how about this as a plan? There are two people standing. You deserve to have a chance to ask your questions. And then we're all going to go get a drink and continue this rich conversation. How about that? Okay. Please.
Okay, thank you. Noelle Tarabolsky from Denver, Colorado. I consult nationwide. I'd like to say that a term wasn't used at all in this discussion, which is generally basic concept of productivity. And a lot of times our elected officials discuss education is equal to productivity. And it's a misnomer, because if you look around the world where productivity is the highest, education is not necessarily the highest. It's just the combination and mixture of all of the topics we're talking about and getting the output from the population. And in my opinion, I graduated in '86 from Duke University, Research Triangle area, and my education was a great return on investment. And I have a nephew who's getting educated, and he has unbelievable student loan debt. And I think from a productivity standpoint and the return on investment for the students and children that we're raising, just unbelievably unfair of the inflation in education. And really we should be focusing on productivity as a combination of the political economy of the states and the government. And there's a great study by McKinsey on that matter in South America that really proves the point of the emphasis on productivity in the combined political economy activities. So just want to mention on that. Any comments on that?
Want to comment?
It's a good point.
I think it's a
Yeah,
good
I think it's a good point.
General agreement. Let's go to our final question.
So, Steve Pontel, also from Southern California. This must be the Southern California half of the room. I guess just a couple of comments. I'm always a little cautious about comparing anything with China, because if you're going to compare a slave-based economy built on corruption versus a free market, that's a little bit dangerous. And I wouldn't necessarily want to duplicate the European economy either. So some of those comparisons I would just caution a little bit. But one of the things you did say, and I guess my question is, how do we do it? Probably the most ineffective constituency group, interest group we have today is the business community. I mean, the business community, or the organizational infrastructure that was created to meet the needs of the old economy is not relevant to the business leaders of the new economy. So chambers of commerce are in decline, Rotary, Kiwanis, et cetera, et cetera. How do you get the business community to actually engage in leadership at the community level? Because most businesses' attitude today is, if they don't get it right, we'll leave. In the old economy, businesses were tied to community. Today, you talk to most business owners and ask, where does water come from? And they'll go, well, it comes out of the tap. And so how do you do that when the economy has shifted so much and business people don't need to know how communities work?
Well, part of it is just what Tom said. The business leaders of today oftentimes are the university presidents and the heads of hospitals and so forth, and they typically don't belong to chambers of commerce. In Birmingham, where I grew up, the biggest employer when I was a kid was the U.S. Steel Corporation. Today, it's the University of Alabama at Birmingham and their medical center. But all of the kind of investments that are making relate to the old economy, because the Chamber of Commerce is all about the the old economy that is essentially disappearing and being transformed into a tech economy. Tom?
I mean, I can speak as a former legislator and a mayor, is that I find the business community their own worst enemies in many ways because they tend to want to protect the status quo. They've found their niche, they're comfortable in it, and that's particularly true for developers, so I can insult everybody in the room, is that they are comfortable in their niche. And so when you start talking about changing that niche, and particularly I can tell you many examples in Pittsburgh when we as a city bought 1,500 acres of steel mills and it went out to the market and said, share our dream of trying to turn a declining city to imagine it growing again and to make investments with us. And the people that showed up at the door, with a couple of exceptions, were out-of-town people, developers, who weren't burdened with the protection of the status quo and stuck in that niche. And so I would say we're in a transition in America from the old industries, the Chamber of Commerce and others that particularly represent traditional industries, sort of protecting and debating about the business taxes and the issues in the community versus where that community is actually going with technology and everything. And they have not organized a voice yet because they're probably too busy growing their businesses. And so that is a real mismatch in America right now in terms of who's speaking for the business community and what are their needs. How, you know, is it simply to cut taxes? If in Southern California, if you had the lowest tax rate in the country and we're not making investments and everything, were you in heaven then? Or do you need those investments in education and infrastructure, and are you willing to pay some taxes for that? So that's a debate that's going on, and what are those investments in infrastructure? Is it the highway out to the industrial park? Is it faster internet and other things that are more important to a technology economy? Or the university doing more commercialization of research? So all those questions are just bubbling up in cities around America and really around the world.
Thank you all. Our goal was to provoke. Our goal was to challenge some conventions and begin a dialogue. It is not done by any means, but please join me in thanking our ULI fellows.